We are beginning a series dealing with vision. And I'm not talking about eyesight, although as I look out at everybody here, most of you have the same thing that I do. You need corrective lenses in order to see right. Maybe this isn't so different after all. Because I don't think that we always see what God intends us to see in ourselves, in our church, or even in the world. I think oftentimes we get caught up in other things. As we go through this series, we're going to be talking about how God has given people a vision and identity. We're going to talk about how people can lose that vision and identity because of things happening around them, what they allow themselves to be distracted with. We're also, at some point, going to talk about how sometimes we fight because what we see as from God is not the same thing. Today, we're talking about receiving an identity from God. God has a plan or a vision, if you will, for us. I know this because he's had a vision for the world and the people that he cares for throughout Scripture, throughout time. God's vision for the Israelite people started with Abraham and the promise to make him a father of many nations. This is part of the book of Genesis. The beginning of this is also fulfilled during Moses' time. God delivered the people from famine by taking them to Egypt. Under the leadership of Joseph, Israel was still a free people, but they were foreigners in a foreign land. Egypt later enslaved the Israelite people after the death of Joseph, and the king that followed did not know Joseph. And they became afraid of the Israelite people because they had grown in number, and the Egyptians were afraid they would join with enemies and overthrow the Egyptian authority. How the Israelite people were oppressed can be found in the beginning of the book of Exodus. God's deliverance and vision for his people can be found in the life and leading of Moses. These people were drawn out of slavery into a new life. In Scripture, sometimes the names of people have significance. How many of you know what Moses means? Scripture tells us what his name means. Does anybody know? It means drawn out. I will name him Moses, for I drew him out of the water. Moses was drawn out of the house of Pharaoh because of his actions into the wilderness, where he received his identity and came to know who he was and what was expected of him. That time period lasted nearly 40 years. He returned to Pharaoh and began leading the people of Israel against Pharaoh until they were drawn out of Egypt. And how long did they wander in the wilderness? 40 years. How many years approximately has the churches and mainline denominations been experiencing decline and confusion over where their future is supposed to be? Anyone want to take a guess?
40 years.
About 40 years. I believe that God has a vision and a plan and identity for his church, in our church, because God has always given his people an identity, and he renews his vision and plan for them as time passes. What we find in the Israelite people is that the beginning of the identity that he is giving them can be found in Exodus chapter 7. Let my people go that they may serve me. So what was their purpose? To serve God. Let my people go that they may worship me. That's the second time. And again, later on, he says, let my people go that they may worship me, that they may serve me. Now, there's something going on in this whole concept of service. God sends Moses and Aaron to speak to Pharaoh. Let my people go that they may serve me. And what happens there is, what kind of people are the Israelites to the Egyptians? They are slaves. What is said there is, let my people go that they be slaves to me. In other words, God is telling Moses to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. They're no longer your slaves. They are mine. I'm taking them over. They are my people. Now, can you imagine walking up to a king and saying, give me your servants and your slaves. They're now mine. How well do you think that's going to go? Probably not real well. And obviously it doesn't go real well to begin with because Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And it continues on. Now, we have to understand there's more of a power play going on here than we realize. Most of us would say that God is all-powerful. We believe that God is all-powerful, but we don't always rely upon God to change things, do we? A lot of times we're afraid that God isn't going to answer our prayers, so we try and fix things ourselves. Or better yet, if it looks like it's going to be too hard to fix, we'll just do without. Right? We'll just let it go. Moses is sent to Pharaoh at the water. Now, in Egypt, the lifeblood of that nation is found in the waters of the Nile. Whoever controls the Nile controls Egypt. So much so that most of the cities, or at least many of the cities, were not built directly on the Nile. They were built just beyond the growing zone, so that the land that was able to be used for food was not covered up. Okay? You only had so much to work with. Pharaoh goes to the water. Moses and Aaron go to the water. Let my people go that they may serve me. In other words, they are to be God's slaves. Pharaoh says no, and so they struck the water. Aaron struck the water, turned it to blood. Pharaoh's own magicians do much the same thing, and this tells you something. Have you ever noticed that some people with power will not give it up? Have you ever noticed that some people that have control over something are not willing to give it up? Pharaoh said, I will destroy the Nile before I will recognize God as having any authority over me, the king of Egypt, a God in and of my own right. You have to understand, Egyptian pharaohs were considered a god. There's a power play. It's not just an identity being given to Egypt, or not Egypt, but to Israel. It's also Egypt being told, by the way, I'm God, I have power over the entirety of the world. Time passes a little bit later, and we have the plagues that have gone through, and Pharaoh changes his mind. The people are allowed to go. And we need to realize that the Independence Day for ancient Israel can be found at the Red Sea. It's where they became free. But they didn't recognize it. Although this is where Israel receives its freedom from Egypt, the story has more to do with God's vision for these people. And it has to do with what God is going to do through them to bring honor and glory to God's self. The Israelite people had received freedom and they didn't know it. Instead, they see water over here, wilderness over here, desert over here, and Pharaoh's army over here, and they start to do what? When things get tough, what do most people start doing? Complaining. They start complaining. They cried out to God. I would assume saying, Lord, save us. But then who do they blame for their predicament? Moses. Now let's take this for just a moment. Moses, why did you bring us out here? Weren't there graves enough in Egypt? Wasn't there food enough in Egypt? Wasn't there work enough in Egypt? Wasn't there a place for us to sleep in Egypt? Wasn't there a life in Egypt? Why did you bring us out here to die? Churches in today's culture. Why do you tell us that we need to change things? Didn't the old ways work well enough? What do you mean we can't do this anymore? We've always done it that way before. What do you mean times are different now than when I grew up? I believe in, everyone should believe the same. How many of you grew up with a radio rather than a television in your home? How many of you grew up with a black and white TV rather than a color TV? How many of you grew up with 2 channels, or 3, if you were lucky, instead of a multitude of channels? How many of you grew up with on-demand? Times have changed, folks. How many of you grew up playing board games and cards? How many of you grew up playing Atari? How many of you now have DSi? How many of you used to use a rotary phone? How many of you had push-button phones? How many of you grew up with a cell phone? Times have changed, whether we want to admit it or not. The old ways don't always work. As a matter of fact, my grandmother had to get rid of her rotary telephone because it no longer worked with the service that she got. Israel is complaining and demanding and blaming Moses, not God, for Egypt's renewed attack on them. While freedom from slavery was attractive when it was put before them to begin with, once they actually received it, they realized that they had work ahead of them, and they became frightened. They didn't have the resources they had before. They had to trust in God. Oh, wait a minute. Just a few minutes ago, I made mention that we sometimes would rather try and fix things ourselves than trust God to do anything, because we're afraid God won't